American and Arab artists in conversation. We'll have a few opening remarks by YUSSEF GUINDI, one of the leading Arab American dramatists today, and then a wonderful panel of Arab American writers and performers, some of whom you've heard before, some of whom are now doing their first presentation at this conference, who are very, very important and familiar figures in the New York performance world. I'm delighted at this opportunity to bring them together and say on this subject. They will be SAHAR, ASSAF, DALIA, BASIOUNY, LEILA, RANIA, KHALIL, AMAHL, KHOURI, and RAFFO, and SHAMIEH. Frank will moderate the Q&A afterward. Thank you.
I'd just like to say to Dalia, please don't review any of my plays or productions in the future. I admire you greatly. I'd be very scared. Okay, this is more sort of more just the reading of an essay than opening remarks. So apologies for the slight dryness of just reading an essay, but it's short. So I'll get through this quickly so we can get to the panel. Okay. And these are just reflections on Arab American theatre as it currently stands. Okay. When it comes to countering the implicit and sometimes explicit prejudices that the larger society exhibits towards Arabs and Muslims, American theatres are not particularly ahead of the curve. While some theatres have bravely and commendably gone out of their way to address the deluge of negativity the mainstream culture exhibits towards most things Middle Eastern, those theatres are rare. This is disappointing. One expects theatre to rise above the crassness that swirls through the currents of mainstream culture. You would hope that theatres espouse values that more commercial fare might shy away from. You want theatre, especially non-profit theatre, to champion values that might interfere with the bottom line. Not that we want theatre to lose touch with a wide audience, lest it become perceived as being even more elitist than it already is. Crassness, after all, can be fun. Theatre has some of its roots firmly planted in the mud, in the foibles and weirdness of human nature. Rising above mainstream culture doesn't mean theatre should eschew any of the broad, popular memes currently in circulation in it. By all means, artists should feel free to infuse their work with whatever is most fashionably current, in style, aesthetics, popular thought, songs, etc. But theatre should also have a critical eye. It should offer up critiques, contextualize, and provide some kind of critical framework through which to view the culture and politics of the day. Because most theatres are non-profits, they should be more daring in terms of the subject matter they choose, staging stories and perspectives that might be hard to find elsewhere. This is the ideal. And given this ideal expressed by many theatre mission statements, I wonder why there aren't more plays by writers who come from the Middle East. Never has any one area of the world had more impact on the US than the Middle East, repeatedly, every year for as long as most of us can remember. In every decade of my life, Arabs and Muslims have made headlines in some capacity, almost always in a negative light. One gets a little punch-drunk during some of these, during some news cycles, dealing with this, from my perspective, battery of biased reporting, in which Arabs and Muslims end up always coming across as seemingly genetically prone to mindless violence, wars, the oppression of women, etc. The go-to images are always large mobs of angry Arab men, veiled women, bearded Muslims in prayer, bomb sites, and so on. I've spent most of my life being gobsmacked by all this, contrasting what I see in mainstream American culture with what I live and know when I travel back to Egypt and hang out with friends and family and imbibe the culture around me. Quite naturally, in a desire to make sense of all this, I turn to the arts as one potential source to put some of these Middle East happenings in perspective. I want to step away from the objectionable objective news and the biased pundit class with their conservative think tank opinions and see how the culture around me processes these events. I hold out little hope that movies will give me the other side of the story. Black and white perspectives sell more tickets than grays, or rarer still, viewpoints directly from the enemy. The best you can hope for in a popular movie that deals with the Middle East is something akin to the cowboys and Indians narrative, in which the vast majority of the Arabs are portrayed as menacing and hostile, except for the good Arab who sides with the West and aids its agents in fighting a particularly nasty leader and his fanatical hordes. In movies, money follows prejudice because simplifying the world into us and them is more satisfying than having to deal with all the ambiguities and qualifiers that are part of most people's daily lives. I expect more from the stage, but in the American theatre, over the past 15 years, for all its talk of wanting to be inclusive, I have rarely seen plays that address what's going on in the Middle East or what is happening to Muslims and people of Middle Eastern descent here in the US, leaving aside the almost total absence of such plays before September 11th, 2001. The ancient Greeks made it a point to address their wars in their dramas. Why is it that American theatre, with rare exceptions, should fail so drastically in this regard? It's an oft repeated observation of American culture that people don't like politics in their entertainment. It is outside the limited purview of this essay to explain this aversion to political theatre in the US, but the fact remains that a whiff of politics would expose you to the charge of having an agenda, of being too didactic or preachy. It's odd that, by contrast, a small island like England can create big canvas plays that address their political culture and their standing in the world, while the US, a world power, and a country that surely begs for ambitious plays, mostly produces small, insular plays that deal with matters of the heart and heart. Am I too close to the microphone? No. It is often argued that some types of navel-gazing can be deemed political, or to use a common phrase, personal is political. A domestic drama may be said to act as metaphor, encapsulating larger political concerns. But most of the time, the politics are so deeply cloaked in metaphor that they can be safely ignored. It's a repeated oddity that the American protagonist rarely seems to care or understand his or her place in the historical and political forces at play. As a consequence, the default setting for American drama is generally war, matters of the heart predominate, uplifting, dreams can be realized in spite of obstacles, and if they're not, it's an American tragedy, and domestic. The individual is paramount, with just enough social commentary thrown in to give it a little bite. The problem is that for most people outside of the West, active politics is part of their daily life and conversation. To self-realize, to pursue happiness, means having to pay attention to government policies and how they affect you. You can't do too much navel-gazing when bullets, tear gas, and arrests are real possibilities, or if you're simply trying to gain basic freedoms and human rights. Consequently, the home life of a lot of Arabs and Muslims is filled with political chatter. To dramatize the daily lives of these two groups and quite a few other non-Western peoples is to unavoidably include the political element as part of normal domestic interactions. Here, the personal truly is political. Americans are so averse to politics in their entertainment that the simple act of including Arab or Muslim characters in a play exposes it to the charge of being overly political or didactic. And if the play is written by an Arab or Muslim, the writer must surely then be peddling some political agenda. Even if, for example, the play revolves around an Arab or Muslim family preparing a Thanksgiving dinner. Though nothing political is uttered, the play is regarded as making some kind of statement. Or worse, the play gets gets dismissed as social activism rather than being judged on its artistic merits. The very act of rendering a group of people usually depicted negatively in a three-dimensional way is deemed a political act. Whether the writer intends it or not, they're seen as trying to address something, to right a wrong. Such criticism has been leveled at some of my plays, even though I never have a conscious political agenda when I set out to write a play. Like most playwrights, I'm focused on seeing to the needs of my characters. I'm focused on craft and character passions, not on trying to sneak in some political agenda, or to have a character wield the political axe I'm grinding. Where's the fun in that? I'm always surprised when I get critiqued by a reviewer for having some calculated agenda, as if the play was written as a platform to express my political views. Artistically speaking, Arabs and Muslims are in a predicament in the theatre. We cannot walk on stage unburdened by the political framework in which we exist offstage. As a group, we are fraught with all the accrued bad news heaped on us. As characters in a play, regardless of what we do, it's hard to shed the manufactured political narrative we've been assigned. Existentially and dramaturgically, we become politicized. While other characters can come on stage with a question mark hanging over them as we wait to find out who they are and what they want, with Arabs and Muslims, our entrance sets up a set of expectations, usually all negative, which these characters will either subvert, at which point the political agenda accusation might be brought up, or confirm, at which point the play might then be safely celebrated, since the audience's prejudices have been validated. This scapegoating echoes the way other ethnic groups have been treated on stage in the past, and often still are. African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Latinx characters have historically made their stage entrances carrying their share of political baggage. Baggage that is spilling over with other people's stuff, not their own. The political burden attached to these and other minorities has begun to lessen as more varied depictions make their way into the mainstream culture. It takes a while, and the struggle to unpack that baggage is still ongoing. But for Arabs and Muslims, that unpacking has barely begun. Arabs and Muslims, even in liberal Western eyes, have come to embody the sins of patriarchy, sexism, religious fanaticism, mindless violence, and machismo of a kind that is seen as particularly dark and menacing. Never mind that these sins are as rampant in other groups all over the world. In Jungian terms, Arabs and Muslims are currently the groups upon which others get to project their shadow elements. In theatre's fitful embrace of multiculturalism, then, Arabs and Muslims have rarely been included, as we tend to fall outside the multicultural comfort zones. That's because multiculturalism, as it stands now, often operates as a depoliticized zone, a place where diversity has been smoothed over to appeal to the greatest number of people with the least amount of friction. Commonalities are sought, differences ignored or diminished. It's a way to bring people out of politics and into a gentrified history. If you can't be gentrified or depoliticized in this way, you can't be welcomed into the multicultural fold. Arabs and Muslims, it seems, will have to wait in the wings until we can somehow shed the disconcerting political trappings that currently hang over us. Or perhaps the trajectory of an idea like multiculturalism is inevitably to open up to ever more inclusivity. I'm enough of an optimist to believe that the promise of diversity will eventually have to include the voices of the nearly 2 billion people that comprise Arabs and Muslims in aggregate around the world. I believe that more and more theatres will start to program plays by Arabs and Muslims, as some already have. But it's only likely to start happening in our nation's regional theatres when Arabs and Muslims can be seen as fully dimensional people, not as mere triggers or symbols of political controversy.
to. Share some of the ideas. So, first of all, again, Yusuf, thank you so much for this, in a way, State of the Union address, and you speaking about unpacking. How can you unpack your baggage really, and how can people share that experience, and also does it, the multiculturalism, this buzzword from the 90s, seems to be we don't depoliticize, and so everybody is singing together and holding hands. It's not really allowed anywhere. So these are significant questions. So the question really is, how does it feel like to make art, to make theater as an Arab artist, as an Arab American artist? So I would like to ask maybe first our panelist who hasn't been here yet with their own presentation, and maybe I'll just go down the line and start with RANIA. Maybe you take it back. I hope it's clicked on. From what you heard, and I know you also followed the live stream, how does it feel like to make art as an Arab American artist, or Arab artist?
I'm just going to think for 1 second. I think what's been on my mind lately is the way in which we as Arab American artists have to somehow function on top of this place where all of our people abroad are being murdered, and that is so deeply normalized in our society. So when I'm thinking specifically of the way in which plays have these characters where, okay, I should also say that I'm a performance artist and not from a very particularly theatrical, like theater background.
Maybe tell a little bit what you do.
Gosh, I wish I wasn't the first person to go. Sure. All right. I'll just do one thing at a time. So when we're and I also want to thank Yusuf so much for your talk. I'm a big fan of your work, by the way. Big fan of your work. That we go to the theater and we see people dying or people hurt, and that we're still, I feel, as Arab Americans somehow at this place where we're living in a culture that has a kind of massive amnesia about the fact that we're dying en masse, that Palestinians are the subjects of genocide, and for me that is what it means to make Arab American theater. I think I'll talk a little bit about my practice theater, if that's okay.
Heather, it's about you and your work, and about Yusuf's.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I mean, there's a weight and a lens through which one feels like there's annihilations and genocides and wars and traumas and PTSDs, so that even when one looks at, well, we're saying we want to write about a family drama about anyone in Louisiana, who cares, it's the weight is still on the person, and the person is still the playwright. So no matter what angle one takes, I agree. There's a pressure to the DNA, right? And as AMAHL was talking about earlier about impossibility, I feel that's equally true in the American theater. I know that sometimes artists from the Middle East, question why does it feel so impossible in America? But I would say that this idea, as Betty was saying earlier, for how many plays she writes, which ones get produced, I mean, it's getting your play produced is nearly impossible as a fact, as a technical fact. When you look at all the people of color plays and the percentage that any of those plays share in the landscape of American theater, and to think that the Middle Eastern voice and the African American voice and the Latinx voice and the Native American, like the technical, it's a near feat anyway. Let alone what I know one of the things we're going to talk about is if we're being supported by institutions, and if we are, is it only to write the thing that they want us to write versus coming to the table as an artist with a lens through which whatever we might write could be informed by an experience that, you know, we're all in. And the last panel spoke about the in-between, and I think everyone up here will, that's a pretty big category. One thing that I'm working on in my work right now, where I'm flipping the lens on myself, is that I'm quite like Dalia was talking about the catharsis, the need for catharsis. Well, I'm forming an idea, so I'm not going to be brilliant in my specifics of it, but the idea I'm forming is that so much of the American theater is focused on empathy. So that when you're in the female slot or the Middle Eastern slot or the African American slot, you're in the empathy slot. Now, I'm not saying that it's not true for all plays in the American theater, but I will say that it's empathy on the whole might be a goal of the American theater. We want to go, oh, I want to feel something, I want to feel and empathize, right? And I'm starting to feel like perhaps empathy is perpetuating the problem to begin with. So I'm personally in my own work flipping the lens and looking at value over empathy. And I don't know where that lives exactly yet, but it's living in a place where I'm interested in somebody saying my female character is not sympathetic. And me going, did anybody watch the trial yesterday? Right? Like, trial, look, I call it a trial. And it wasn't, it was as we say, a job interview. Like, just to, you know, like, just to flip these lenses on how I'm, even myself in my own work with a successful play that did reach people in the middle of a war, I can go, okay, well, that was 14 years ago and it's still ongoing. And I get emails every month about how it's changed somebody's life. But then what? Right? Has the nation changed? What's changing, and how do we get at value? So that's what I'm chewing on.
Leila, what comes to your mind?
So many things. One of them is just, forgive me, I have my phone here because one of them is the idea of solidarity and reflection on how we connect to other communities. So I want to, in my ignorance, because, and I want to name this, I know this, I usually do this as a practice, but I forgot until 2 minutes ago because of the day that it's been, to look up, and I should know this because I live in New York. Who are the peoples whose land we are sitting and speaking on right now? So from my extensive Google search, and I welcome those watching and those here to please correct me, some of the tribes, and actually the word is not tribes, some of the First Nations, the first peoples of the land that we are sitting and speaking about these issues on, were the Abenaki, the Cayuga, I get emotional about it, the Erie, the Laurentian, the Mohawk, the Mohegan, including Montauk and Shinnecock, the Munsee Delaware tribe, the Oneida tribe, peoples, forgive me for the language that's on here, the Ononda, and the Seneca, and the Lenape. So just to name, for me right now in this moment as an Arab American artist who comes from multiple backgrounds, my mother is Lebanese, from a mixed Muslim Christian family, my father is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American. I have inherited all of those things and the privileges and the challenges that come with them. And so for me, a lot of my work is about creating spaces to use theater, which is such a unique tool in the world we live in, especially right now, because it requires people gathering live with each other and engaging with not only words and images and experiences, but each other's energy, each other's breath, each other's laughter. So to me, the opportunity to create spaces for that, and doing so as a performer as well as a writer, is why, for me, we do what we do. And because we all know how much stories matter, presumably I think one wouldn't commit one's life to something this hard if, if one didn't believe that. With that comes a responsibility. I grew up watching how our policy towards the people that are dying every day, as RANIA mentioned and began so importantly with, from our peoples, those things happen in large part because of the stories people in this country hear, because of the stories we choose to believe, because of the stories that are passed on. I've lived on the other end of wars when that narrative changed, and suddenly we were bombing people or stopping bombing people because people here started to believe a different story. And so just because of all that, I'm reflecting a lot as an Arab American artist on my privilege because of my name being relatively pronounceable, because I don't wear hijab, because I speak with a relatively American accent, because I carry this citizenship, and because I pass for many things that are not Arab. The challenge, the charge, the reflection on how do the stories I'm choosing to tell and the way I'm choosing to tell them impact the minds and hearts of the people who hear them and see them, and how does that impact the lives of people sometimes thousands of miles away. And I don't mean to say that my work is so grand, but I do believe that when you see a story that moves you about a group of people, or a story that makes you think a group of people are dangerous and frightening and violent, as YUSSEF was pointing out so beautifully in his introduction, that shapes what people in this country vote for, what they are willing to passively ignore, what they are willing to allow to happen in our name here and all over the world. And those things are, we all know, very real. So for me, that's what it means, is to struggle with wanting to allow your voice to write about, as Heather said, whatever you want, and also bearing, as you've all spoken of, this responsibility for the weight those stories can and I think should carry with their power. No pressure.
Well, there's the question what Heather said, but 14 years ahead, like what now? So and if there's the gathering, that what do you feel what can be or should be done in the ideal world, and what's missing? To hear those voices heard.
The question was with Arab Americans. Who are you talking to now?
In general,
yeah.
For yourself, yeah, as an artist.
I feel because it's some of us are in the Arab world, some are here, some are between. It's a completely different context. So
yeah. Let's hear about it. Yes, from that's the idea of the panel.
I'll say one thing that's being talked about in America, inside the Middle Eastern, North African American artist community, is how to allow for a multiplicity of voices to be supported by the American theater. So when there is only one slot and that one voice kind of gets put up, and then they say, well, that's the Middle Eastern experience, and as we all know, that's like one aspect of an experience. So this idea of how to create festival structures, or how to get multiple theaters on board with producing plays and or readings from diverse voices from the Middle East, but all at the same time. So that audiences can and press can, in when they're interacting in that kind of situation, immediately see that there's a multiplicity of voices and perspectives. I think this is an incredible and unique opportunity for us to talk about censorship, because one of the things about being a Palestinian American artist is most communities of color work in the face of indifference. We are working in the face of active hostility, and it's a different thing to be facing active hostility as opposed to just indifference. And I feel that while we were talking about the American context, I would love to, one of the things that I found was so fascinating about the first panel was that I really felt for the first time that the connection between the struggle artists of Arab descent have here is very connected to the struggle. And I think sometimes, you know, I did a show called The Alter Ego of an Arab American Assimilationist, in which I talk about gamma racism, where you're functioning in a society where people are racist but they don't know they're racist, so it's actually harder to deal with. So I'd love for the Arab audiences to be pulled in, the Arab artists to be pulled in, and for us to have a real exchange about how what we're facing is connected to what you're facing with active versus subversive ways of silencing us.
I mean, I hear you, and I feel like the essence of our work as theater maker, and there's a similar struggle in a way, like the issues you deal with here probably are different than the issues we deal with back home. Back home, I don't have to, you know, this idea of identity, it's not a, for me at least, it's not a challenge. But the question of why we're doing theater, to who are we doing theater, to whom are we doing theater, and is it really going to change anything? That's a valid question every day, you know, and what Dalia was saying in her presentation, and especially in that quote that you shared at the end, you know, not to challenge what your criticism of the play, because I don't know the play you're talking about, and I understand that sometimes it can be very dangerous to just ridicule issues like rape or just for the sake of making comedy. But I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on theater, we want theater to change the world, you know, but in my view, at least, I kind of made peace with that idea. I'm not making theater that would lead for a revolution. I wish I can do that. I wish people would burst out of the theater onto the street, changing the governments. But I kind of made peace with the idea that if I can transform one individual in the auditorium, if I can touch one person, it's enough for me. You know, because I think it's too much to ask of theater. I hear everything you're saying, and it's a load, really. You know, because you have to be an activist to do theater these days. You have to be really committed, and you have to be really, you know. For me, not only in love, you have to. There's nothing else I can do. Otherwise, I would be doing something else for sure. You know, so that's. I just wanted to say that this is, you know, this is something probably in common rather than, you know, the issues are different, but the...
Well, what are, would you like to exchange places? Do you think it's easier to do Arab theater, Arab American theater, or are there similarities on the complications with the face? Or would you rather work here than in Beirut?
I think it's hard for Arabs everywhere. I mean, in Germany, you're expected to perform being a refugee, and that's here it's you're a terrorist. I mean, everywhere comes with that kind of idea of what you have to, the ethnicity that you have to perform. And then when we go back home, we're faced with censorship of a different kind, and that's financial or actual censorship from government institutions. I think theater has a lot of risk and potential, and that's understood everywhere we go. In any context, it's always a dangerous and very difficult, it's a very protected thing, and we're not allowed in for different reasons, in different places, but also for the same reason somehow. I mean, it's wonderful to be among, you know, Arab women here, and just we're all kind of feeling the same thing. It's a very powerful moment for me. I just wanted to recognize that. Thank you.
Betty, you move between two worlds, and often I see you stand between the fronts. Tell us a bit about that experience.
I just have to laugh when you were talking about, is it harder to be dealing with American theaters or be a Palestinian, trying to get through a checkpoint? So I think I got it a little easy, I gotta say. I'm a Palestinian American playwright, and 10 years ago I was much more fiery and a little calmed down. This is Betty Light. But because I've come to peace with the fact that what has happened to me personally what happened to the African Americans in the 1920s, which is all my work is being done in translation in Europe, and none of it about America, about my experience here. And I was very fiery about that. And fiery is a polite post-therapy word. About how profoundly hurtful that is to me, especially when every major theater has some sort of lip service, like what YUSSEF so eloquently articulated, as he often does in his work, it's a very hurtful thing to see people getting governmental, federal, foundation funding to do diverse works and to completely isolate and ignore the most vulnerable members of our theatrical community. So I've come to peace with that. And the joy of only being able to focus on the work is something I don't feel I have the luxury of doing. I do it in the space where I'm creating, but when I'm speaking about it, I feel like it's very important that I advocate for how difficult this space is. And the difference, again, between the African American community is nobody was saying we're getting funds from the government and foundations to do diverse works. They were just, we are doing what we want to do. So it's a profound, dislocating falsehood at the heart of our funding situation in this country. But yet, I'm not going to be so fiery about it. I'm just going to do my work and really celebrate the fact that this panel is something that I could not have envisioned coming out of drama school, in which I spent 3 years not writing about Palestinians or only writing about them in my little closet and never showing them, because I was so sure that there was no space for my voice in this culture. Until I realized I had to write about it or I couldn't write. So it came down to the very start.
I need to speak to something. I just want to say quickly on your point that I'm piggybacking on, as I agree about her point about funding in the American theaters. There's still slots called the reading slot or the workshop slot, right? And that's where we can get a foot in, and that's what gets them the grants, but we don't get the productions. So we're definitely being used. We supported some Middle Eastern theater artists to come do a workshop or a reading of such and such, but that person is not on the main stage.
I want to address the difficulty of making theater wherever you are in the world. I was starting a project in Karen Malpig, if you're familiar with her work, was starting a project here, and we decided to keep a video diary of our different projects, of like all the hassle and the craziness that she has to deal with doing her own funding for a play because her work is not funded because it's political, and the million other problems I am dealing with. So doing this, theater is not kind of a choice in a way for some of us. We are doing it because if we could have done anything else, we would have. So there's something that it's a shared commonality between people who are doing this kind of work, especially the work that is controversial, that is touching people's life, addressing issues that are not mainstream. But I'm also wanting to connect to the issues of identity within the diaspora and the issues of representation if you're in other places, and the voices that inside my head that I self-censor sometimes, because if I'm getting one chance at presenting a play, what do I want to be seen? If you're here and you're doing something, you will not want to talk about domestic abuse, for instance, because then they would say, oh, but all Arab men are violent because they only saw that one play. I have a different dynamic. trying to present work with women, about women, and if there is a voice that I'm really self-censoring constantly, not the political stuff, but other stuff, because it might be my last play. And if this is the only play that they would see, what do I want them to see? So it's this constant battle within before even it becomes without or with the others, or to try to get funding, to try to have a voice.
Just want to jump on that.
Take another one.
Just on something you said, Rania, something you were saying, that, well, a lot of stuff you're all saying, but the context of making theater about Palestine in this country, I think, just to say a little bit more, I've done some work there, because I'm not Palestinian, but I've spent time there and done work there, and I'm struck, there's a letter going around right now, actually, that I'm struggling with, because there are calls to boycott, for example, Israeli companies that are sponsored by the Israeli government in coming here, because that is part of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement that's modeled on that brought down apartheid in South Africa. I won't go into all of that, but the call is to boycott a production that's coming, right? And as a theater maker, I never want to boycott someone else's work, and yet this is a call from Palestinian civil society about the way that a government that many would say is an apartheid government, certainly an illegal occupation, is giving money to a company to come here that is funded and sponsored as part of a campaign stated by that government to distract from military actions with artistic actions, to focus on the art that comes out of Israel. This is a stated campaign, and as a theater artist, I'm struggling with this moment of I want to be in solidarity with the ask to say this shouldn't be happening or we should be protesting this. At the same time, as a theater artist, I never want to do that to another artist. And we as a community, especially if you're Arab, you will be named as though you were doing that because it is a Jewish company, an Israeli company, when in fact Jewish Voice for Peace, many progressive Jewish organizations also stand by this boycott. So thinking about, and I have been told by artistic directors of 2 theaters that they would love to do my play that has to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but their board threatened to fire them. And I just want to say that this is not something we make up, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's real, and it's hard because you can't name why someone doesn't produce your play. It's not quite that easy. You can of course say it wasn't as good as the other plays, or that playwright has more on their resume, or whatever, and that might be also a big part of the reason. I'm not saying that play wasn't produced only for that reason, but I do feel it's important for us to speak to this because it is the thing that makes me afraid. I'm afraid saying this to you right now in this little wonderful warm room, knowing that it's going on a live stream, of the impact on my career as an artist. And yet, and this happens, and that is nothing, as Betty points out, compared to the daily lives of Palestinians, and compared to what happens to Palestinian artists whose work is kept from coming here before it's even at the stage of being here and protesting. So I just want us to be thinking about those things. I encourage you to go to the Jewish Voice for Peace Artists Council. If that makes it easier to see and hear. They have a wonderful breakdown of these campaigns. And also to the idea of, and also a call to producers, because we talk, I talk a lot about sort of this accountability of what our stories are representing. That shouldn't be on us. We should be able to write whatever we want to produce the work that we want. And I want to ask producers of the U.S. theater, because we have Central and South America and all the Americas, but of U.S. theater to say, why am I drawn to a play that fuels a stereotype of a Muslim man who is violent because his religion taught him to be so? Why am I drawn to the plays about the woman who has an abusive father who happens to be Muslim? These are stories, and they should be told, but why are they the stories we see so much more than so many others on the largest stages and in the most places? And can producers and artistic directors and directors, and even ourselves, I think anyone who lives in this country has absorbed some of these stereotypes. Can we look at what are my biases and inevitable assumptions about this entire culture, and how are they informing the work I make, the work I produce, the work I direct, the way I do it, and the work I choose to put on stage? How is that impacting the whole culture of US theater and the environment in which we all are trying to work?
Yeah, I agree with so many of the sentiments that are being raised here today. I also wanted to talk about something that is very dear to me, which understandably there's a huge fury at the institutions which are preventing, censoring, blocking, traumatizing us as artists. I've also been living abroad for the last 10 years, partly in Cairo and partly in Helsinki, Finland. And so that, I should just say, informs also some of my thoughts and perspectives. But a while ago, I felt like I had to make a choice about who my work was for. And I decided that I could only make work for my community, people like myself. I guess it's a writing tool, yeah, that you write for people like you. Now, I guess both my partner and I, who is also an artist, have just decided that we write for our daughter and future generations. But I think that one of the things that we can draw on as Arab Americans is the fact that as people of color, we are also a part of a legacy of outsider theater that's begun by African Americans and carried on by Latinx, Native American, Asian, etc. Artists. And so I think that then the questions and the problematics somehow shift when the point isn't to necessarily inform or get recognition by those external structures, what happens to the art. I think there's also been some things floating around about activism in theater. And for me, I find that dichotomy sort of perplexing and baffling, because for me they're inextricable. I would have to go very far out of my way to not make political theater. I'll just pause there.
Just coming also to the theme of the conference, our dramaturgies. I happen to be also in Japan. It was in January, February in Yokohama for the T-Time conference. I went with Peter and Axel. There was also a session on Asian dramaturgy. I think people from Indonesia or India or Korea or whatever, they felt a strong connection in a way that there's something that is their landscape that connects little archipelagos and little islands who together form a landscape. Do you feel like listening to what we did here the 2 days? And that's a rhetorical question, really, is a research for us also, but do you feel, is there some narratives that connect? Are there some dramaturgy that are specific or American that connect? Or do you feel it's a universal question about how to tell a story?
Just say one last thing I was thinking about. I'm not sure if this speaks to your question, but maybe in a roundabout way, is this question of commodification and fetishization of ourselves, of our stories, of ourselves as artists. And having lived and made work and performed in these three very distinct places, I would say that probably being in Egypt, where it's like a very homogenous society that I think is divisive along class lines, probably more than anything. There still exists this element of commodification, because I think a lot of people, depending on what kind of circles you flow in, Dalia is obviously like a very deep activist in Egypt, so she has her own, I won't speak for you, but I'm just trying to make a division here between what I witnessed in Cairo, where there is a kind of like neo-colonial vying for recognition on the international art scene. And so still that problem persists. And then what you so eloquently said about like having to perform being the refugee in Europe, where I think that the problematics in Europe and in America are the same but different. they just have a slightly different face, but how does that commodification and fetishization of ourselves, of our stories, of our beings as artists, how does that also affect our work and the things that we have to say?
If I can come back to that, I think like the issue of representation, for instance, that also Dalia spoke about and Leila articulated beautifully. It's not only like, you know, Arabs in Europe, for instance, or Arab Americans in America, but it's also within the country, like what happens in Egypt with the funding story about, you know, you have to sell your proposal to the foreign funders because our own governments are not supporting theater. So if I'm, for instance, if I'm one of the lucky few who doesn't have to commit to that because I have a private institution that supports the work that I like to do. So but I don't know if I was working outside EBB, if I will have to, you know, change, like pick topics or themes or issues to tackle that would, you know, suit whatever stereotype or whatever like funding mission that is meant for the country. You know, I think a perfect example is Mohammed Al-Attar. I've seen his work in Lebanon and I think he's a brilliant playwright. I don't know if Mohammed Al-Attar in Germany, like, to honestly like raise a courageous question, I don't know if he chooses to write about something else rather than the Syrian war, if he would get funded. We saw AMAHL this morning, you know, we had a taste of what a playwright she is. Why would such a topic not get funded in the West, you know? It's these questions like are connected. Yeah, you can answer that for sure. So I think it's not only here, it's everywhere, and I want to put part of the responsibility on us as well. Like, what kind of image do we want? Like, what are we doing to tackle this? I love the example that Betty shared this morning from the first play that we spoke about, Chocolate in Me. You know, how brilliant is that? How beautiful is that? Can we keep on doing this? I don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about, like, just also it's something I feel that joins us is, like, sometimes I look at white German people who went through the system and who know all those people from their grad schools and who, you know, they just have these social networks and they have this kind of very typical, I want to say, I don't have a better word, life, and I'm so jealous. And I think about how many, like how we lack that, how we don't have access, and how we don't have those special networks, how we haven't jumped through all the hoops, or we don't look like them, or we don't, it just like, for me, especially as a Jordanian, I mean, your question was what it means to do theater as an Arab. For me, it's very hard to answer that because I have to only speak as a Jordanian, and as a Jordanian, it's a very funny paradox to do theater. Theater is a collaborative art, and I have zero network as a Jordanian. In Jordan itself, you're expected to do theater about, how do you say it, like your heritage, and your just like, I don't know, a debke or something, and like very cliche ideas about our traditions. Or they don't understand it, and then, you know, I go to Germany, and it's like, as a Jordanian, I have no absolute, I have no access, and it's, for example, a Syrian has a better chance than I do in Germany. I have zero chances. So I'm just curious about if we could talk a little bit about what kind of networks you do and don't have as Arab women doing theater, and YUSSEF as well, or which ones you're lacking. You know, if we could talk a bit about that, because this is a collaborative art, and we find ourselves so often battling alone. And this is, for me, a huge contradiction. Theater needs so many people to get done, and I'm like, I'm alone here. Okay, discuss.
My quick answer to that is this is a project that is being developed right now, and you were invited to take part in it. The Mediterranean Lab, and Catania is here, just to say thank you also. This is my answer to it. Like when I first, Anne was in Lebanon when I first pitched the idea to her and some Lebanese theater makers, and one of the responses we got is, why not making an Arab lab? And I was like, I'm not interested in an Arab. I don't know what that is. Like, I would know what a Mediterranean lab could be, but I don't know what an Arab lab could be. So that's one of the things. Like, we have to work towards changing the terminologies that we're using. It's a Mediterranean. It could be any of these, continents. It could be in Southern Europe. It could be North Africa. It could be Asia. But it's not of this, and it's all of this. But again, I'm speaking from a very empowered position, being independent in a way. If someone is not, yeah.
Lab means the tradition of the director's lab, like for a
Right,
couple of weeks.
it's a sister lab to Lincoln Center Director's Lab that is being founded in the Mediterranean region. The idea is that it will rotate Mediterranean cities. So now on the committee of that lab, we have directors from Lebanon, Jordan, Spain, Italy, and Athens, with working together with Lebanese theater makers, with also directors from France who has taken part in the Lincoln Center Directors Lab. So it's gonna tackle issues related to the Mediterranean, but it's gonna be also open to the world. So it's one way, one kind of network to really connect with one another, to also figure out together what are some of the theatrical traditions that would inspire our work and that we actually use in our work.
I think part of the problem, to your question about collaboration, I think part of the problem is we definitely want to collaborate with theatres. Just theatres, as we've all been discussing in various ways, don't want to collaborate with us. I think as marginalised voices, we're not the warm and cuddly marginalised voice. I think when theatres, I don't know. I think there's just a way you have to be as a quote-unquote minority to be included. And I think Arabs and Muslims, what I was trying to say was, I think we're just too kind of pointy and spiky and fraught with all this political baggage. We're at the moment unembraceable. We're too kind of fraud for theatres to go, oh yes, we want to make, if they're going to include us, it's going to be the kind of controversial play of the season, or it's not going to be the feel-good play of the season. So I think that's the, and I think it's just our place. If you look at before 9/11, where there was a total absence, where there was no interest in Arab and Muslim voices, it wasn't even an antipathy, it was just a difference. And I think it's just the process of the long road to inclusion. If you look at other groups where they're not included in the mainstream fold, they become a problem. Whether it's the Irish Americans, African Americans, different groups, Jews, Italian Americans, they become, oh, we can't let this group in, or and then voices from that marginalized groups come forward to counter those mainstream negative narratives, and it's just a fight, from one generation to the next to get in, and we're just at the very early stages, it feels like, to that.
I'm just going to say this. I have to say, I do feel that we can talk a lot about institutions, and I think it's important that we do, but I also should say that I don't think the Arab American theater community, and probably in some ways the Arab theater community, doesn't help themselves. I feel sometimes we're beset with some of the problems in the Arab world, and that there has not been institution building, there has not been cohesive kind of like that happened in the African American community and with Labyrinth in the Latino community, and with Mayi in the Asian community, and a lot of it is because we're different. Our connection to Arab identity, language, our politics, our countries we come from are different. And I hope 20 years from now, you know, the next generation of Arab American artists are like, yeah, you know, because I was involved with really trying after 9/11 to create institutions that had a producing history, and not even on a large scale. Like MIE is not a huge company with a huge budget, and that hasn't happened, and that's on us. And I think a lot of it comes from that kind of sense of there's only room for one, so we're not going to help other people rise up. Whereas that's actually the opposite is true. If you see more successful Arab American plays, you're more likely to produce another Arab American play and make that the one play that knocks out the Korean American play because they've only got slots for two. You know what I mean? Like, so I have felt that within the Arab American theater community, and I'm sure in the Arab world it's that jostling for, like you were saying, colonialism. You need the master to come and tell you, oh, you're the one who we're going to take and put in an international festival, or give you a Fulbright, or give you some sort of, you know, you want kind of, I don't know if this term makes sense in the Arab context, but you want white daddy to come and save you and legitimize you and put you in the big house. And it's something that I grapple with. What is my responsibility to younger Palestinian American artists? And I'm only speaking from my own community because I do think my own community has a unique challenge. That some, you know, even the word Palestinian is scary to people. So it's not, you know, when I apply for grants, I often put Arab American, just because I know if I put Palestinian American, there's gonna probably be at least one of the judges who's never seen somebody identify as that, you know, or who, you know, thinks there's no such thing as a Palestinian, and you know, so I'm grappling with, as I age and as I've been in this game longer, what is my responsibility to younger artists, and how I am or am not fulfilling that.
Well, I have been away, but I want to speak also to your point of community, because I feel like I have a slightly maybe altered but complementary perspective on this, which is that the five of us here in the middle, like I know you all from our Arab American theater community, so I'm a little bit surprised by some of the things that you guys are saying, because I feel like actually Dalia's work has like pulled us all together. Dalia has written extensively, I think, on everyone on this panel, and I think did a lot. I mean, in the post 9/11 theater community, there was so much organizing. I don't know what happened to it exactly. I know that Noor Theater grew out of that. I think they do a lot of good work. That's where I've seen YUSSEF's work. And so maybe, like, we're all getting, you know, a lot older now, and so maybe some of that, you know, has like worn off. But I think also in terms of what you're saying about communities, like, you were out of the room, Kayhan, but right now I'm directing. I had the honor to direct this play by Kayhan Irani, who is an activist and Iranian Indian performance artist and writer, and I think that the way I think I've taken a lot of inspiration from Kayhan in the ways in which she has fused very seamlessly activist and theatrical concerns, and so I find a lot of community in that, whether it be like with actual people or with people who have similar like conceptual concerns that I have. Right now I'm also working on a project which concerns histories of erasure. In my family, my grandmother was she was an organizer in Cairo of this Pan-African Asian women's rights organization in the 60s. And as I work on this project, which like obviously suffers from a profound lack of information, like I have all these family photographs and very little information, it kind of, in the same way that feminism does, just kind of puts a new lens on the way that I'm living my life and the way that I'm seeing things. And I feel like there's also like histories of erasure within Arab American communities. You know, even the fact that we are struggling right now on this panel to think about our own communities, you know? But also, I have not read this book. Has anyone read this new book that's out about Arab American activism from the 60s to the present? mean, I don't know anything about it, but it's there. What?
Is it by Pamela Hennig?
I'm not sure. Have you read it?
Yeah.
Seen it? Yeah. So I think that the weight of the oppression that we're facing is what creates this erasure, and it just speaks to a point that Yusuf was making about the ways in which you feel like we're prickly and spiky. Like, I feel like similar to African American communities, the way that the oppression is directed at us as if we're so violent just speaks to the extreme violence that's being laid upon us, you know, and to normalize that somehow by making us the violent ones.
I want to piggyback on some of what you were saying, Rania, and just say, first of all, before I forget, to the book point, I'm in the process of designing and teaching my first class on creation and representation of Arabs and Muslims in U.S. theater. And I am getting a great education, even though I thought I knew a fair amount about this. And I want to make sure you all also know about Michael Malik Najjar's wonderful book, Arab American Drama, Performance, and Film, that also chronicles a lot of the history of this, both long before 9/11 and afterwards. And since that's the dividing point a lot of people tend to use. But and there are other anthologies of Arab American plays. Many of the people in here are in them. So there are ways of getting to know this community. And to speak to community, I absolutely agree, Betty, that we see the fractures that happen in the world in the theater. And I do think that is an obstacle that we face in our community. And I think that's also an obstacle that you see, certainly I just came from a wonderful gathering with Art Equity, which is a wonderful organization, talking to different communities of activists and facilitators from Native peoples, and First Nations, from Latinx and Asian American and other and African American communities, and very, very similar. You know, those divisions are in every community. So I also don't want us to sort of, you know, that happens with every group, particularly when you're put under the gun in so many ways. Those fractures tend to come out. I'm Lebanese American, but I also put Arab American for the opposite reason you were mentioning, Betty, which is I feel like Lebanese tends to be like one of the sometimes easier ones for people, and for me the solidarity is to put Arab. But I just want to also name that, yeah, in the time after 9/11, and starting before it, many of us, and Betty was with us in the beginning, and then several of us for 7 years ran an Arab American theater company in Nibras that helped support the Arab American Comedy Festival in its early years, which brought a lot of people together also. That did a lot of one-off events, but one-off events that brought people together and gave them a chance to express themselves in different ways. It was not a producing institution, certainly, but it also gave rise to the community that then, it created the relationship with New York Theater Workshop that we still have as a community. That was a big part of giving rise to Noor Theater, both through Maha Shahlawi, who was part of Nibras and co-founded Noor, and through a lot of the people that we gathered. And Noor Theater, while yes, they do not have the production history that some main theaters do, has done a production, is doing another production this fall, has done highlight readings that many of our works have been in, does a 48-hour forum every spring that brings a lot of community together. And I also feel like we should name Silk Road Theater in Chicago that's been doing work that is across Silk Road communities, not exclusively Arab, but certainly includes Arab for a long time now, since I think 2001, actually. And certainly Golden Thread in San Francisco that has been doing that for 20 years across a lot of the Middle Eastern American communities. So just to name that on an official institutional sort of company level, there are those things. And then, you know, as Rania was speaking to, so many of us have connected and collaborated in different ways through the years, just by finding each other and making the work, as you were naming Kayhan's wonderful work. And so just, I think, a little bit of the hope of that, and certainly we see the Minasa actor group now, we see more in the folks that are coming up now, organizing, gathering, collecting, creating together even more. And I think our spikiness, to what you were saying, you know, let's also hold people accountable. There's plenty of spiky plays. I mean, you know, Disgraced was the most produced play across the country. It's about an extremely spiky Muslim character.
It's not spiky, it's whatever.
Well, yes, and it's, well, but I'm saying, I see what you're saying. You mean spiky as in challenging.
Yeah, challenging.
Yes,
There's
yes,
a
yes.
challenge.
Yes, okay, that's a good, thank you for that clarification. So the idea is that it's hard for people to accept us challenging biases versus, yes, okay.
I think it's important, sorry, also to mention KHOURI at this, among those names, because she's done so much work to bring Arab Americans and Arabs together.
Yes, thank you. I can't believe I forgot that.
She's in Dubai.
Can I ask something based on what you're saying, Leila, and forgive my ignorance? How difficult or easy is it to find like funding from Arab institutions here, like Arab wealthy individuals or, you know, companies, corporate, you know?
Well, I just wanted to say that's what I meant about institution building. And that's what I've actually turned to doing, directly going to and saying, and it's very hard when somebody's funding refugee camps and playgrounds in Gaza to be like, can you come fund me and my friends to do this show? And that's something that I have to grapple with. And it's, you know, I have enough survivor's guilt without asking people for money. So, but it's something that that's what I'm saying. I agree with you, there are beautiful things that have happened, but I think in 20 years, if there is an institution with all of this energy and all of these artists identifying as Arab American and presenting themselves as representatives of our culture, it will be a shame if in 20 years all we'll have said is that company did a show once and we hung out then. And because there's a lot of energy and there was a lot of interest post 9/11, and I think we dropped the ball.
In terms of, I'll just want to go on record, I don't think we dropped the ball, but we can disagree to disagree. I think we did more than hang out. But I think we do, I think it is about getting particularly Arab funders to understand the value of the work we do, to speak to that point of what is the value of storytelling, what is the value of theater. And it is hard, like you said, when it's up against very, very concrete needs. How do we also advocate for that?
So we are close to the end of the session. I have one or two questions or remarks from the audience that came from listening to this, I think, extraordinary panel of artists who sit next to each other now. They haven't before, I guess. You know.
I have two things actually. In regards to Muhammad Al-Atta, I think he would still tell the same stories, he would just tell them differently. Because I think that is the thing about not speaking the language while working in that country. So he has a dramaturg on it, and when I watch the plays, I can see their signature. So I think that is how it would be different, because I think it's still his stories. And the other thing, because there was a lot of talk about funding, which I find very interesting. In Germany, it just works a bit differently in terms of funding. It's so eclectic, there are so many possibilities. But what I'm just wondering is, you were talking about you want Arab institutions or Arabs, let's use that as an umbrella term, to support it. My question is like, who? Who would you want to support who can ethically and morally really be a supporter of this? Because we're not going to get our governments to do it, thank God. But who?
Individual wealthy patrons. I mean,
Being on board, you know, being also, it doesn't always have to be money. It is also being on boards. You know, if there were more Arabs and people who supported what we do on boards of theaters, we might also have more voice in people advocating for our work and seeing its value. You know, yeah, there are cultural arts organizations.
I will just share my experience from Brussels, because I know that when we did the culture, we did some studies lately, and for all the production in performing art, there is more and more a kind of sum of co-producer, because there is less money. So all the projects, we need like a kind of diversity in partnership. And this diversity in partnership to allow you to do your project, it's also will imply what is your relevant partner. I mean, ethically, content-wise. Do I prefer to work with ASSAF, or do I prefer to work with this foundation? What is the agenda of each one? So there is a kind of awareness about this sum of partner, because we cannot do without having, like, for one production, like small performance, we reach like 10 partners to co-produce the work. So that is more and more this way of doing that is kind of pressure for all the artists.
Thank you. I mean, just as a little side comment, we at the Siegel Center most probably host the most diverse groups of people here. We have African American, Latino American, Asian American, Native American. Also, nobody would come, for those 2 days who are not part of this group, as it is the other way around. It's also always studying, so it's easy to say, and I think maybe the mindset is different to collaborate with things like they are silos, and I hope this is a contribution in a way to open this up. But even for me, it's always stunning to see that. Maybe one last question or thought.
Thank you so much for this discussion. What I found really interesting is that, of course, as we listen to you, we may assume that you are all on the same, the same boat, right? But at the same time, what I am hearing a little bit is that there is also a discussion within the group of Arab American playwrights about what to write about what is really, meaningful and what is less meaningful and all that. And I think that a sort of a discussion within a group itself is usually very sort of helpful in terms of, creativity and productivity and so on and so on and so on. So I was wondering whether, there is that kind of a discussion happening among Arab American playwrights, rather than just a discussion between the majority public and the Arab American artists.
I think to some degree, if a theatre decides to stage your play, they're staging your play because you're performing your ethnicity in some way that, sometimes I will write a play that has nothing to do with Arabs or Muslims, and then at the end of the process I'll go, yes, but why would they want to do this play? They want to go, well, don't you have another play that addresses, I wrote a play recently that they were people of color, they were immigrants, and I got critiqued for not specifying the ethnicity of this is one time where I felt I didn't need to specify. One of the problems was I didn't want a theatre to go, we'd love to do your play, but we don't have any Arab American actors in wherever, the small town outside of New York or Los Angeles is hard, and I just didn't want that to be a reason. So I just left them vague, and I could get away with it, but I was criticized for that. And to me, I just felt, well, what kind of dramaturgical criticism is it that where one line could solve the dramaturgical problem if I just named them Egyptians at one point, and if they go, well, no, we want more of that, then she's cooking a meal, should she be cooking an Egyptian meal? It's like, what level of authenticity do you want? And it's like, when we go to Ethiopian restaurant or we want the authentic experience. And what this critic, this white critic, I don't know who she was, that's what she was kind of suggesting. I wasn't getting an authentic Arab or Muslim experience. And I kept going, yes, but what level, what did you want? I mean, should the dress be, you know? So, anyway, that's, let me move it on. I have hours I could talk.
Maybe a word from you about your experience of the Sundance Lab. You went to, were you able to, maybe tell us a bit about your thoughts and your experience.
So I'm the white daddy gatekeeper. I don't feel comfortable speaking, but no, I mean, I'll say that Sundance's impetus to support the work of people writing in Arabic, it's a language-based initiative. It's not a regional initiative. Was really to expose US artists to artists from other places in the world. It wasn't about helping anybody, actually. It was about the fact that US artists are woefully isolated and not even curious about work outside our borders, which I discovered 2 decades ago. So we spent 12 years in East Africa in 6 countries first, and then turned to the region of the Middle East and North Africa because there was so much vitality there, particularly in the wake of the Arab Spring. So the center of our work, the focus is to create community. And we felt that we were tired of creating it from the point of view of America, so we decided to move our lab, our American lab, to the Middle East, requiring US artists to travel to the Middle East to do their work and to meet with artists from across the region at the same time doing their work. And we've done that twice. Big labs, 80 people, 10 projects, 5 from the Middle East, 5 from the US. And you know, it's been a gift to us. I mean, what I've discovered mostly is this extraordinary joy from the artists working in the Middle East. I mean, extraordinary joy from Iraqi choreographers to artists from Tangiers, from artists from Lebanon in particular, which feels like it's a real hotbed. I mean, Beirut just feels like it's sort of right now sizzling, in part because Cairo's had such trauma and continues to, but it feels like, and so I mean, we're going off to the sidewalks festival in Beirut at the beginning of November. We're going to bring a couple of US artists, actually US and Rwandan US artists, to perform, but mostly just to see work and talk about what it is to do it, what play development means. You know, what we don't produce, we don't present, and so we're the space in between when you have an idea for a project and we're not going to produce the play. So if you need 3 weeks to work on a piece, that's where you submit your piece for us to consider including. And the only thing I wanted to say was when I hear everyone speaking, it's such a beautiful panel and it's just got my mind going in a million directions. But at Sundance, one of our board members is Ava DuVernay, who is an extraordinary director, and she talks a lot to artists of color, particularly African American, but all artists, and a lot to women. And she keeps saying, you can keep knocking on the gates, but ultimately you have to build your own as well. I mean, you have to also knock on the end, you have to also build your own, and that's what she's basically done. And she spent the better part of her life actually creating a business, so she had a business plan, and then she had enough resources to begin to do that. But when she talks to other artists, I'm always very moved by that, because I feel like both of those avenues are so important, and that's what you're all talking about as well, you know? So I just wanted to say that, I don't know, I just feel hats off to you all. It's a remarkable moment, and I don't know, my life has been completely changed by the ability I have to travel and see and meet people and see work. Has been amazing. The work of Zukak recently, you should probably know, has a piece called I Hate Theater, I Love Pornography, which is so much about what you're talking about, which is how you fall victim to funding to do the work. If you have a Syrian dramaturg in the room, you can do the work, and they're struggling quite openly, I think, with what that means for their own integrity.
Well, I think we are a bit over time, and there is, I think, much more to say. We will have now downstairs a reception at 5:30. I hope you all will come on the 3rd floor, but I think these are good words to think about gates, to knock, but also to build. I really would like to thank you for coming and participating. I think it's important to listen to artists and not to talk about them, but have you here. It's an incredible honor for us, for the City Center, to have you here and to have created this in collaboration with the American University of Beirut, the PhD program in theater. So I think I would really like to thank a big thank you to you also for the audience to come, and I would like you all to come and join us for the 5:30 wrap-up. We have some remarks from Albert and Peter. And afterwards, also in the archive for a drink afterwards, if we have something. But really, it's a beginning, I think.